She was standing in the parking lot of a funeral home in Clarksville, Tennessee, when his daughter walked up and said it. Not quietly, not in private. Right there, in front of the pastor, the funeral director, and 3 of her own children. She looked at Margaret, looked at her like she was something that had crawled in from outside, and she said, "You were never going to be one of us. You just wanted what he built." Margaret didn't move. She didn't cry, she didn't defend herself. She stood there in her black dress, her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at that woman, at Renee, her stepdaughter, who was 47 years old and had called her Margaret exactly twice in 6 years, and she said nothing. Because there are moments when the wrong response destroys everything. And Margaret had learned, at 61 years old, that silence is sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can carry. Let me tell you who Margaret was before I tell you what they did to her. She was born in Cookeville, Tennessee, 3rd of 5 children. Her father worked at a lumber yard. Her mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and kept the family's books on a yellow legal pad she stored in the kitchen drawer. Margaret watched her mother do that, watched her track every dollar, watched her stretch every paycheck like a woman stretching fabric over a frame, careful, deliberate, never wasting a single inch. That's where Margaret learned arithmetic, not from school, from a kitchen table in Cookeville. She went to Middle Tennessee State University on a partial scholarship, studied accounting, graduated in 1984, got a job with a small CPA firm in Nashville. She was good at it. Not just competent, good. The kind of good that made the partners nervous, because she was thorough in ways that made their sloppiness visible. She married at 28, a man named Gerald, sweet man, soft-spoken. They had 2 children, a son named Daniel and a daughter named Claire. Gerald died in 2006. Heart attack on a Tuesday morning while he was making coffee. He was 52. Margaret was 45. She raised Daniel and Claire alone. She kept her job. She bought the house outright, not because she was wealthy, but because she was careful. Because she tracked every dollar on a yellow legal pad, just like her mother. She didn't date for 8 years. 8 years. Not because she was punishing herself. Not because she didn't want companionship. But because she had a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old and a career and a mortgage, and she understood that her time was not something she could afford to spend carelessly. She met Robert Calloway at a charity auction in 2014. He was 63, widowed, a former civil engineer who had built a small real estate development company in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, over 30 years. Comfortable, not ostentatious. He wore clean clothes and drove a sensible truck, and he laughed with his whole chest, which Margaret had not seen a man do in a very long time. They talked for 2 hours at that auction. Not about money, not about their pasts, about books, about how Tennessee changed in the summer, about what it meant to outlive someone you loved. He called her 3 days later. They dated for 14 months before he asked her to marry him. She said yes. She was 53, he was 64. And from the moment they announced the engagement, Robert's children, Renee, 51, and Thomas, 44, treated that announcement like a declaration of war. She didn't see it at first. She wanted to believe it was grief, that they were still holding onto their mother, who had died 4 years before, that they needed time. Robert's first wife, Carol, had died from ovarian cancer in 2010. She had been a beloved woman, church-going, community-involved, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and made casseroles when neighbors had surgery. Margaret understood that she was not Carol. She never tried to be. But Renee and Thomas did not want a replacement for Carol. They wanted Robert's estate to remain undisturbed until it descended to them. That is the truth that took Margaret 2 years to see clearly. The wedding was small. 40 people, a church in Murfreesboro that Robert had attended for 20 years, a reception at a private room in a restaurant on the square. Renee and Thomas came. They dressed appropriately. They smiled in the photographs. But Renee did not speak to Margaret at the reception, not once. And Thomas gave a toast that was entirely about his father and contained no acknowledgement that Margaret existed, except one line at the very end where he said, "Dad, I hope you find what you're looking for." Margaret heard that. She filed it. She was an accountant. She understood that some numbers don't belong in the current column. You put them aside and you watch them. The first 2 years of their marriage were, by any honest measure, good. Robert was kind. He was attentive. He was the kind of man who noticed when you were tired before you said so. They traveled some. Nothing extravagant, a trip to the Smoky Mountains, a long weekend in Charleston, a road trip up to Vermont in October to see the leaves. Margaret kept her job at the CPA firm. She did not need Robert's money. She had her own. That point matters. I need you to hold that. She had her own money, her own savings, her own accounts. She had contributed to her 401k since she was 24. She had paid off her house. She had modest investments she had managed herself for over 20 years because she was an accountant and she understood that no one protects your money like you do. She was not wealthy, but she was secure, independently secure. Renee and Thomas did not know this. Or rather, they had decided, before they ever learned anything about her, that she was the other thing, the easier story. In the fall of 2017, Robert had his first health scare. A TIA, a transient ischemic attack. A mini-stroke, they called it. He was admitted to Vanderbilt Medical Center for 3 days. Margaret sat with him every day. She drove the 40 minutes to Nashville in the early morning and stayed until visiting hours ended. She spoke with his doctors. She asked the questions he didn't think to ask. She took notes. She did this because he was her husband and because she was thorough. She did not do it because she was managing an investment. But Renee showed up on the second day and found Margaret sitting with his doctor in the hallway, notepad in hand, and the look on Renee's face was something Margaret would not forget. It was not gratitude. It was suspicion. After the doctor left, Renee took Margaret's arm gently but firmly and said, "I need to be the one handling his medical decisions. He's my father." Margaret looked at her and said, "Robert has a healthcare proxy in place. I'm his wife. But I understand you're frightened, and I'm not trying to exclude you." Renee let go of her arm. She didn't apologize. Robert came home. He recovered. The doctors adjusted his medications, monitored his blood pressure, told him to reduce stress. Margaret told Robert what had happened in the hallway. He listened. He sighed. He said, she's protective of what she thinks is hers." Margaret heard every word of that sentence. What she thinks is hers. She asked him, quietly, whether he had thought seriously about his estate planning. He said yes. He said it was in order. He said his attorney, David Marsh in Murfreesboro, had updated everything after their marriage. She asked him what updated meant. He told her. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. She started making lists. Not because she was greedy. Because she had watched her mother track every dollar, and she knew that the women who don't pay attention are the ones who end up with nothing. Robert's health stabilized for 3 more years. They were good years, easy in the way that time feels easy when you are not fighting. But the relationship with Renee and Thomas did not improve. Renee called Robert regularly. She visited on holidays. She organized Sunday dinners at her house in Franklin, a beautiful house, big kitchen, 2-car garage, the kind of house built with the assumption that a certain life would continue forever. Margaret was always welcome at those dinners. Or rather, she was always invited. Welcome is a feeling. Invitation is an obligation. She went. She brought dishes. She was gracious. She listened to Thomas's opinions about the real estate market. She complimented Renee's cooking. She was present and polite and professional in the way that women learn to be when they are in rooms where they are being quietly evaluated. But she noticed things. She noticed that, when Robert and Thomas discussed the development company, she was never included. When Robert's attorney called and needed to confirm something about the estate, Renee happened to be visiting and positioned herself within earshot. When Robert mentioned updating his will after his TIA, Renee called 3 times in 1 week. Margaret noticed all of it. She did not say much, but she began meeting quietly and separately with her own attorney, a woman named Susan Hargrove in Nashville, who specialized in estate law and had been recommended by a colleague. Susan listened to everything. Then she said, "Margaret, you need to understand exactly what your position is before something happens, and you're reading documents under pressure." Margaret nodded. She already knew this, but it helped to hear someone else say it. Robert died in March of 2021. Not suddenly, not the way Gerald had died, no warning, no preparation. Robert had been declining for 8 months. Congestive heart failure. He came home from the hospital in January with oxygen and a hospital bed and a home health aide who came 3 times a week. Margaret became his primary caregiver. She reduced her hours at the firm. She managed his medications. She coordinated his doctor's appointments. She sat with him in the evenings and read to him sometimes. He liked history, specifically anything about the Civil War, and she held his hand when the nights were hard. She did all of this, not to secure a position, not to manage an outcome. She did it because she loved him, imperfectly as people love, but genuinely. He died on a Thursday morning in March, at home, in the hospital bed in the living room, with Margaret beside him. His children arrived an hour later. The funeral was at the church in Murfreesboro. 300 people. Margaret sat in the front row with Daniel and Claire, who had flown in from Austin and Atlanta. Renee sat on the other side of the aisle with Thomas and their families. That arrangement was not an accident. The pastor gave a beautiful eulogy. People lined up to speak. Margaret did not speak. She had asked Robert, in one of their last conversations, what he wanted, and he had told her to let the people who knew him a long time do the talking, that it would mean more to them. She honored that. She stood at the graveside in the cold March air. She watched them lower him into the ground beside Carol, because that was where he had wanted to be, and she had made sure of it. She drove home alone. And then, 3 days later, standing in the parking lot of the funeral home to finalize the paperwork, Renee walked up to her. Anne said it. "You were never going to be one of us. You just wanted what he built." Margaret stood very still. She thought about a lot of things in that moment. She thought about the Sunday dinners. She thought about the hospital hallway. She thought about 8 months of caregiving, the medications, the oxygen tanks, the nights she slept on the couch in the living room so she could hear him if he needed something. She thought about her mother's yellow legal pad. And then she thought about Susan Hargrove, her attorney, and the conversation they had had 6 months earlier. She said nothing to Renee. She completed the paperwork. She got in her car. She called Susan from the parking lot and said, "It's starting, be ready." What happened next unfolded over 14 months. I need you to understand the pace of it, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was methodical. It was the kind of conflict that happens in law offices and courtrooms and probate hearings, where the real violence is done with documents and depositions, and the quiet, patient work of people who understand that the person who waits longest usually wins. Robert's estate was substantial. Not extraordinary, but substantial. The development company, Callaway Land Group, had been valued conservatively at $4.2 million. There was commercial real estate in Murfreesboro and Smyrna. There were personal accounts. There was the house, a 4-bedroom house on 3 acres outside of Murfreesboro that had been their marital home. Robert's will, updated after their marriage, left the house and a portion of the personal accounts to Margaret. The business and most of the investment portfolio were split between Renee and Thomas, with a trust established for his 4 grandchildren. It was not a disinheriting, it was a division. Margaret received approximately $1.1 million in assets. The house, valued at $640,000, and the remainder in cash and accounts. Renee and Thomas received, between them, approximately $3.8 million. But that was not enough. 6 weeks after the funeral, Margaret received a letter from Thomas's attorney, a man named Gary Whitfield in Nashville, with a firm that specialized in contested estates. The letter was 12 pages. The core of it alleged 3 things. First, that Robert was not of sound mind when he updated his will in 2018, following the TIA. Second, that Margaret had exerted undue influence over Robert during his illness to secure provisions in the will favorable to herself. Third, that certain personal property, specifically Robert's collection of Civil War artifacts, valued at approximately $90,000, and a piece of commercial real estate in Smyrna that had been transferred to Margaret's name in 2019, had been improperly conveyed. Margaret read the letter at her kitchen table. She put it down. She poured herself a cup of coffee. And then she called Susan Hargrove. "This is a standard challenge strategy," Susan told her. "When a spouse inherits and the adult children feel the split is wrong, this is what they do. They allege incapacity and undue influence because those are the hardest things to definitively disprove. They're betting you'll settle." "How much do they want?" Margaret asked. "They haven't said yet, but based on what I know about Gary Whitfield, they'll come in asking for the house and the Smyrna property. They'll settle for the Smyrna property and a cash payment." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if I don't want to settle?" Susan paused. "Then we fight, and I need to warn you it becomes public. Your marriage, your finances, your relationship with Robert, all of it goes on the record. Probate challenges are civil proceedings, but the details are not private." Margaret said, "Let them look, I have nothing to hide." She meant that, but she didn't yet understand how much it would cost to prove it. The first deposition was scheduled for August. Margaret had 4 months to prepare. She and Susan worked methodically. They gathered every document: bank records, medical records, the deed transfer for the Smyrna property, correspondence between Margaret and Robert's attorney, David Marsh, dating back to 2016. They got Robert's medical records from Vanderbilt and from his cardiologist. They contacted the home health aide, a woman named Patricia, who had worked for them during Robert's final illness, and Patricia agreed to provide a statement. They located 3 witnesses who had interacted with Robert in the years after the TIA and could speak to his mental clarity. Susan said, "You need to understand what the other side is going to do. They're going to paint a picture of a woman who isolated Robert from his family and manipulated a sick man. They will use his illness as evidence of vulnerability. They will use your financial background as evidence of calculation. And they will use the fact that you kept your own accounts, your own finances, your own attorney, as evidence of premeditation." Margaret looked at her. "My independence is going to be used against me." "Yes." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we use it for me. We show them what independent looks like." The deposition took place in a conference room in Nashville. Gray carpet, a long table, a court reporter in the corner. Gary Whitfield was a tall man in his mid-50s, very composed, with the particular patience of a man who believed he had already won. He asked Margaret about her finances first. He went through her accounts, her salary, her savings, her 401k, the investments she had managed herself. Then he asked the question she had been waiting for. "Mrs. Calloway, isn't it true that you maintained separate financial accounts throughout your marriage to Robert Calloway?" "Yes." "You never fully merged your finances with your husband's." "We had a joint account for household expenses. Beyond that, we kept our finances organized according to a structure we both agreed to." Isn't it unusual for a married couple to maintain that degree of financial separation? No, it's actually quite common in second marriages, particularly where both parties have independent assets and children from prior relationships. It protects everyone. He moved on. He asked about the Smyrna property. She explained it. The property had been transferred to her name in 2019 because it was being used as collateral for a small business loan. a loan that had been entirely repaid from Margaret's personal accounts when the business in question encountered a temporary cash flow problem. Robert had agreed to the transfer in writing, with the full knowledge of his attorney, because the debt obligation was Margaret's, not his. She had the documents. She had the loan agreement, the repayment records, a letter from David Marsh confirming Robert's understanding of the transfer. Whitfield went quiet for a moment. He shifted to the Civil War collection. She explained that too. Robert had given it to her as a gift, a documented, notarized gift, in November of 2020, during his illness. He had told her he wanted her to have it because, in his words, she was the only one who had ever listened to him talk about it without looking at her phone. She had the notarized gift document. Whitfield looked at his notes. And for the first time, Margaret saw something shift behind his eyes. Not defeat, not yet, but recalculation. Patricia's statement was filed in September. It was 9 pages, handwritten then transcribed. Patricia described, in specific and quiet detail, the 8 months she had worked in the Calloway home during Robert's illness. She described Margaret's care of him. She described Robert's mental clarity, his humor, his specificity, his ability to discuss complex topics about his business and his estate clearly and consistently until the final month of his life. She described one particular afternoon in January, 3 weeks before Robert died, when Renee had come to visit and Robert had become agitated after the visit. He had said in front of Patricia that his daughter wanted him to change the will and he refused. He had said, specifically, "My affairs are in order. Margaret knows what she's doing. I won't have her disrespected." Patricia had written it down that evening in her personal notes. She still had the notebook. "I need to tell you about the hearing in December, because that is where the story turns." Not concludes, turns. The probate court hearing was scheduled in Rutherford County. A judge named Honorable Ellen Ray, 62, Tennessee-born, who had been on the bench for 17 years. The courtroom was small, wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the kind of room where the state spends as little as possible on the appearance of justice. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with Susan Hargrove. Renee and Thomas sat at the other table with Gary Whitfield. Margaret had not spoken to either of them since the funeral home parking lot. They were 10 feet away from her. She did not look at them. She looked at Judge Ray. Whitfield opened by presenting the incapacity argument. He called Robert's primary care physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, to testify about the cognitive effects of TIAs. Dr. Webb was careful. He testified about the general risk of cognitive impairment following TIAs. He acknowledged that Robert had experienced a degree of memory difficulty in the months following the 2017 event. Then Susan cross-examined him. She asked him, specifically, whether Robert had been declared cognitively impaired at any point following the TIA. He said no. She asked whether there was any medical documentation indicating that Robert lacked the capacity to make legal decisions in 2018, when the will was updated. He said no. She asked him to look at a document, Robert's records from a cognitive assessment conducted by Vanderbilt in early 2018, at the recommendation of his cardiologist. The assessment showed mild, age-consistent memory challenges, no dementia, no impairment, a MMSE score of 27 out of 30, well within normal range for a 67-year-old man. Dr. Webb acknowledged it. Whitfield shifted back to undue influence. He called Thomas to the stand. Thomas was a presentable man, well-dressed, emotional in a controlled way, the kind of witness who understood that judges are people and people respond to sincerity. He testified about his father's deteriorating health, about how Margaret had taken over the management of Robert's medical care and financial affairs, about phone calls that didn't get returned, about visits that felt monitored. And then Susan cross-examined him. She asked him how many times he had visited his father in the 12 months before his death. He said frequently. She asked him to be specific. He paused. She presented the home health aides visit log, which also documented family visits per their care protocol. Thomas had visited 11 times in 12 months. Margaret had been present for every one of those visits. Susan asked whether, in any of those 11 visits, he had observed anything that concerned him about his father's mental state. He said yes. His father seemed confused at times. She asked whether he had documented those concerns, reported them to his father's physician, or raised them formally in any way. He said no. She asked why not. He didn't have an answer. Renee was called to the stand the following morning. She was composed. She was believable in the way that people are believable when they have convinced themselves they are right. She talked about her mother, about what her father had built, about how Margaret had appeared in their lives and, in Renee's words, systematically positioned herself to take what the family had worked for generations to create. It was effective. I won't pretend otherwise. But then Susan asked her something simple. She asked Renee whether she had ever, at any point, asked Margaret directly about her finances. Renee said yes. Susan asked what she had learned. Renee paused. Susan asked the question differently. Did you ever, prior to this proceeding, conduct any investigation into Margaret Calloway's personal net worth or financial history? Renee said she had not needed to. It was obvious. Susan said, what was obvious? Renee said, that she needed what my father had. Susan said, I'd like to submit Exhibit 31. Exhibit 31 was a financial disclosure document. Prepared by a certified financial examiner, contracted by Susan Hargrove, using Margaret's personal records, records that Margaret had provided voluntarily and in full. The document showed Margaret's financial position as of the date of her marriage to Robert Calloway in 2015. Net worth, $1.47 million. All of it independently accumulated, over 30 years, on a CPA's salary, through disciplined saving and careful investing. The house she had owned outright was worth $380,000 at the time of the marriage. She had not sold it. She had rented it out $1,800 a month for the duration of her marriage to Robert and continued renting it after his death. She had entered the marriage financially independent. She had not needed Robert's money. She had never needed it. The courtroom was quiet for a long moment after Susan submitted the exhibit. Margaret did not look at Renee. She looked at her hands. She thought about her mother's kitchen table, the yellow legal pad, the careful tracking of every dollar, the women who pay attention, the women who survive because they understood, before it was fashionable to say so, that your financial independence is the only real protection you have. Judge Ray looked at the document for a long time. Then she looked at the attorneys. She did not rule from the bench. She said she would issue a written decision within 30 days. But Margaret saw her face as she looked at Exhibit 31. And she understood something. The 30 days were the worst of it. Not the litigation, not the depositions, not the hearing. The waiting. Margaret went back to her life in Murfreesboro. She went to work. She drove to the rental house once to check on a plumbing issue. She had dinner with Claire on a Saturday evening in Nashville, and she told her daughter, quietly, without dramatics, the full shape of what was happening. Claire listened. She held Margaret's hand across the table. She said, Mom, why didn't you tell us sooner? Margaret said, because I needed to know I could handle it first. Claire looked at her. Could you? Margaret thought about the question honestly. I think so, she said, but I'm not done yet. Susan called on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks later. She said, Judge Ray ruled. Are you somewhere you can sit down? Margaret was standing in her kitchen. She sat at the table. She listened. Judge Ray had dismissed the incapacity claim entirely. The medical evidence was clear and uncontested. Robert Calloway had been of sound mind when he updated his will in 2018. She had dismissed the undue influence claim as well. Her written opinion noted that there was no evidence of isolation. Robert had received family visits, maintained relationships with his attorney and physician independently, and had expressed his wishes clearly and consistently to multiple third parties. She had ruled in Margaret's favor on the Smyrna property. The transfer was legal, documented, and supported by independent evidence. The Civil War collection remained Margaret's. The estate would proceed as written. There was a line in Judge Ray's written opinion that Susan read to her. I want you to hear it. The petitioner's claim of undue influence appears to rest, at its foundation, on the assumption that the respondent, a financially independent, professionally accomplished woman with her own substantial assets, must have had ulterior motives for her marriage and caregiving, simply because those motives were not evident to the petitioners. This court finds that assumption to be both unfounded and, frankly, insulting to the evidence. Margaret sat at her kitchen table and read that sentence 4 times. Not because it was vindication. Because it was accurate. Because a woman she had never met, sitting in a courthouse in Rutherford County, had looked at the evidence and seen what was actually there. Whitfield filed a notice of appeal within 30 days. Of course he did. Margaret was not surprised. She called Susan and said, "How long?" Susan said, 18 months, maybe 2 years. Margaret said, "Then we keep going." She drove past the house on a Saturday in April. Not the Murfreesboro house, the house in Cookville, where she had grown up. She hadn't been back in 3 years. She wasn't sure why she went that particular morning. She parked in front of it. It was smaller than she remembered. The siding was a different color now. Someone had painted it a pale yellow. There was a child's bicycle on the front porch. She sat in her car for a long time. She thought about her mother sitting at that kitchen table. She thought about how her mother had never been in a courtroom, had never needed to defend herself against a legal challenge, had lived her entire life on the margins of other people's decisions, careful and private and skilled and invisible. Margaret thought, I am what happens when that woman's daughter refuses to be invisible. She thought that, she held it. And then she drove back to Murfreesboro. The appeal was heard 18 months later at the Tennessee Court of Appeals in Nashville. 3 judges. A formal panel, a much larger room than the Rutherford County Probate Court. Margaret sat beside Susan and watched Whitfield argue his case. He was good. I'll give him that. He had refined the argument, tightened the language, focused the appeal on 2 narrow points regarding the Smyrna property transfer and the interpretation of undue influence standards. It was legal work, skilled legal work. But Susan was better. She argued for 45 minutes. She walked the panel through the medical evidence, the financial disclosure, the testimony of Patricia, and the independent witnesses. She addressed Whitfield's narrow points precisely, without excess, the way you address someone who is wrong in a very specific and demonstrable way. The panel asked questions. One of the judges, a man named Judge Nathaniel Porter, looked at Susan at the end and said, "Counsel, in your view, what is the central issue the appellants are asking this court to resolve?" Susan said, "Your Honor, the central issue is whether a financially independent woman who cared for her husband through a terminal illness can be presumed to have done so for financial gain rather than genuine commitment. The petitioners are asking this court to ratify that presumption. The evidence does not support it." Judge Porter wrote something on his notepad. The panel took the case under advisement. Another 4 months passed. This is the part of survival that nobody tells you about. People think survival is the dramatic moment, the confrontation, the hearing, the revelation. But survival is actually this. Tuesday mornings when you drive to work and the case is still pending, and you don't know the outcome, and you have to live your regular life around the uncertainty. Survival is going to a dinner party and answering questions about how you're doing and saying, "Fine," when fine is not the whole truth. Survival is not letting the waiting eat you. Margaret went to work. She filed tax returns. She talked to her clients about deductions and quarterly estimates and retirement contribution limits. She went to church on Sundays. She had dinner with Daniel and Claire when they visited. She exercised. She slept. She did not call Renee or Thomas. She did not reach out to David Marsh, Robert's former attorney, except through Susan when necessary. She waited. She was very good at waiting. The appellate decision came on a Friday morning in February. Susan called her at 7:15. Margaret was already up. She had slept badly. She had known somehow that it was coming. The court affirmed, Susan said. All three judges, unanimous. They upheld Judge Ray's ruling on every point. Margaret sat down on the edge of her bed. She did not cry. She breathed. She thought about the parking lot in Clarksville, Renee's voice. You just wanted what he built. She thought about Robert in the hospital bed in the living room, the way he had smiled at her when she read to him, the way he had said, one evening near the end, I picked right. She had said, yes, you did. And he had laughed. She thought about her mother's yellow legal pad. She thought about all of it, in the space of that breath, the way a person can hold 30 years in a single moment when they've had enough time to understand what those years meant. Then she said to Susan, thank you. Susan said, Margaret, you did the hard part. She did not tell Renee or Thomas. She did not call them, did not send a message, did not drive to Franklin or show up at any door. She let the court papers speak. She let Whitfield's office call them with the news. She understood, at 63 years old, that the impulse to say, I told you so is almost always a mistake, not because the other person doesn't deserve to hear it, but because saying it gives them something to respond to. It reopens the door. She had learned to close doors cleanly. Thomas contacted her 6 weeks later. He called her cell phone on a Wednesday afternoon. She almost didn't answer. She answered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't know what I wanted to say. She said, that's all right. He said, we were wrong about you. She said nothing. He said, I mean the money stuff, we thought. I know what you thought, she said. He said, Dad knew you. He tried to tell us. She said, yes, he did. Another silence. Then Thomas said, I don't know if you'd ever be willing to, I don't know. I don't know what to ask for. Margaret thought about that. She thought about Robert saying Renee is protective of what she thinks is hers. She thought about the Sunday dinners. She thought about the toast at her wedding, Dad. I hope you find what you're looking for. And she thought about how it must feel to be a man in his mid-40s who loved his father and got so afraid of losing what his father had built that he burned down the very relationships the building was supposed to protect. She said, I know you loved him. Thomas said quietly, yeah. She said, I'll let you know if I want to talk more, but I need some time. He said, okay. She hung up. She put her phone on the table. She sat with that for a long time. Renee never called. Margaret did not expect her to. Some people, when they are wrong in a very particular way, when their wrongness has been certified by 3 separate judges and the appellate court of the state of Tennessee, cannot find the door back to the person they wronged. It's not always pride. Sometimes it's shame. Margaret understood that. She had enough compassion to understand it. But compassion doesn't require you to maintain contact with people who treat you as a category, rather than a person. She made her peace with the distance. She stays in the house in Murfreesboro. She's thought about selling it. She's thought about moving closer to Nashville, maybe, or closer to Claire in Atlanta. She hasn't decided. She kept her job at the CPA firm. She's senior partner now. The rental house in Cookeville brings in its regular income. She added it to her estate plan last spring, a clean document, notarized and filed with Susan Hargrove's office, specifying exactly where every dollar goes when she's gone. Daniel and Claire know about it. She sat them down and walked them through it the way her mother might have walked her through the yellow legal pad, deliberate, clear, without drama. Daniel said, Mom, you've thought of everything. She said, I've tried too. She drove past that funeral home in Clarksville last fall. She wasn't sure why she went that way. She was visiting a friend from college who lived near there, and she took the long route back, and suddenly she was in that parking lot. She didn't get out of the car. She sat and looked at the building, the plain white facade, the small sign by the door, the parking lot where she had stood in her black dress while a woman told her who she was. She thought about what she would have said if she had known then what she knew now. She thought about it honestly. She would have said the same thing. Nothing. Because the silence was right, not because she was weak, because she was patient, because she understood that the parking lot was not the place where the truth would be established. The courtroom was. And she was ready for the courtroom. She had always been ready. I want to ask you something. Because I've told you everything, the documents, the depositions, the financial disclosure, the appellate decision. And I've told you what Thomas said on the phone and what Renee never said. But here's what I keep thinking about. Robert knew. He knew before he married her. He knew who Renee was, what she believed, how she thought about money and inheritance and belonging. He told Margaret in the early years, Renee is protective of what she thinks is hers. He knew. And he married Margaret anyway. He updated his will anyway. He gave her the Civil War collection and notarized the gift, looking his attorney in the eye, with full knowledge of his own mind and his own heart. He did all of it knowing what would happen. So I keep thinking about a question that doesn't have a clean answer. Was he protecting Margaret? Or was he setting the stage, knowingly, deliberately, for a reckoning he had been too tired or too careful or too afraid to force himself? Was the will the real act of love? Or was the will the thing he owed her for 6 years of being treated as less than she was in rooms where he could have spoken and didn't? And when Thomas called her on that Wednesday afternoon and said, I don't know what to ask for, was that the beginning of something real? Or was it just the last move in a game that had already been decided? Margaret hasn't decided what she thinks. She sits at the kitchen table sometimes, in the house in Murfreesboro, with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad. She writes things down. She tracks the numbers. She thinks about what it costs to be underestimated. And she thinks about what it costs to be right. And she hasn't yet decided which one is heavier. This has been Tailies with Bays.